Welcome to the 4Heroes podcast. We're back with an episode from the 4Heroes Huddle. While Chaplain Frank Mercer was away, Jimmy Kinnaird came and shared a message from 2 Kings chapter 7. You may not have heard this story before, but 4 lepers are used by God to defeat an entire army threatening God's people. They had no idea what God was planning, but they were facing impossible adversities. An intense terminal illness, an incoming army. Are you facing adversities today? Well, these lepers looked at their options and decided to act. They looked at their options and decided to move forward.
I thought today I would talk to you about something in the Old Testament. If you have a copy of the scriptures, this is kind of an obscure passage out of 2 Kings chapter 7. It's about how we handle the impossible adversities that come in our lives. I mean, every so often there's going to be something that will come into your life that you just don't have an answer for. This is where your faith in the Lord is tested and your ability to move forward is tested. Let me set this up. The setting is in the northern kingdom of Israel. It's after King David, it's after Solomon, it's after Rehoboam when the kingdom split in two. It's a descendant of Rehoboam named Jehoram who's the king of Israel. And he's king in the northern part, and the capital city of the northern part is Samaria, of all places. And it's not going well for him. Jehoram was a bad king, okay? And I know today we don't have experience with bad leaders at all, do we? So we can't relate, but let's try to relate today. Jehoram was a bad leader. He would have his own prophets, and then he would have the prophets of God. And the prophets of God would say, Jehoram, don't do this. It's not going to be good. God doesn't like it. And Jehoram would say, well, let me ask my prophets. And he'd ask his prophets. His prophets say, oh, no, go ahead and do it, Jehoram. Whatever God has put in your heart is a good thing. You just go ahead and do what your heart wants to do. And so he would do it, and it would be terrible. And he'd never put 2 and 2 together that, maybe the problem is me. The main prophet of God back then at that time was Elisha. Not Elijah, but Elisha. And Elisha detested Jehoram. In fact, if he was in the same room with the king, he wouldn't even acknowledge that the king was there. The king would say something to Elijah, and Elijah would go like, did somebody say something to me? I thought I heard something. I mean, he would just totally ignore him. And I don't know how he got away with it other than he was just Elisha, Kind of like Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa could go do anything, say anything to anybody she wanted to, and nobody could do anything to her. Nobody would dare to because of her authority. Elisha was the same way. The bad part, the thing that got so bad was that the city of Samaria was surrounded, the capital city was surrounded by an army of Assyrians. And the leader of that army was Ben-Hadad. And he had surrounded the city. No food could get in, no water could get in. They wanted the Israelites to surrender to him and give up. Jehoram wouldn't do that. Well, it was so bad that cannibalism was even going on inside the city. As bad as it was inside the city, it was even worse outside the city gates. And outside the city gates, there were 4 lepers. They were beggars, and this is where the story picks up. So I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll talk about it, okay? So the story is just about 5 or 6 verses, and it starts at verse 3. It says, there were 4 men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate. And they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter into the city, the famine is in the city, and we will die there. And if we sit here, we'll die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we will live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and of horses and the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come against us. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, and their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. And when the lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent and ate and drank, and they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. And then they came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. So there's the setting. There's a big army outside of the city of Samaria. They're starving inside the city, and there you have 4 lepers in the middle, okay? So bad, really bad conditions in the city. The enemies surrounded them, and then you have these lepers that are starving too as well. Now, as bad as it was in the city, it was worse outside the city gates because there was no defense. They knew that eventually the Assyrians were going to come, and who would they kill first? Well, they kill whoever's outside the city gates, outside the city walls, and that was the lepers. Do you know what leprosy is? It rots you from the outside in. You start losing feelings in your fingers and hands and feet, and therefore you don't know when something's hot or when something's sharp. You end up kind of harming yourself, but it also rots away eventually the flesh and the bones. So there's no cure. There's no cure for leprosy. Back in the Old Testament days, when somebody had leprosy, theologically, what did the people view them as? Cursed by God. So these guys, let's put it this way, let's look at their condition. They were sick, first of all, no cure in sight. They all had the same thing. Secondly, because they were viewed as cursed by God and because people shunned them, they were isolated. They were lonely. And the only company that they had were other lepers. And let's face it also, they weren't living in a time where there were a lot of welfare systems set up for them. Also, let's say this, the economy wasn't going very great in the Northern Kingdom either. Remember, everybody was starving. They were even resorting to cannibalism to survive. The only thing they could do to get money to make a living was to beg. And who's going to give to a leper when everybody else is starving too? So they were isolated, they were broke. Mental health-wise, they were probably very depressed. The people that had the least chance of contributing to society and getting Israel, the Northern Kingdom, out of this mess with the Syrians, the least people possible would have been these 4 lepers outside the city walls. And yet we know from the story this is exactly who God used. So here they are, sick, lonely, isolated, depressed, broke. It's like the hee-haw song. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. That's where they were. The thing that most people would say for them is the best thing you could do is just go ahead and die. That would probably have been the most logical thing to do, is just to give up. But they didn't. And here's why. They realized that no matter how bad things got, there's always a choice. They had 3 choices, actually. So remember the first choice? If we sit here, if we stay here, we're going to die. I've used this with churches and congregations because we've got congregations that are kind of stuck where they are. They don't want to make any changes because they think that eventually people are going to come around and start showing up at their church. And I tell them basically, if you just keep doing the same thing, you're going to keep getting the same thing. You're going to die. And I hate to say this, but since I've been here, it'll be 3 years in August. We've already closed 2 churches. And both churches closed because they realized that if we stay here, we're going to die. They had conversations about that, and they decided we're going to just stay here and we'll die. And they did. Organizations can be that way. We as individuals can be that way. We can say, I'm not going to make any hard decisions in my life. I'm just going to keep going the way I'm going. I'm just going to keep living the way I'm living. And I'm just going to hope that things will be different. Well, as you've heard, a lot of people have said this before. Hope is not a strategy. The second option, they said, was to go back into the city. Well, is the city going to let them in? No. Why is the city not going to let these 4 lepers in? Because they're lepers. In fact, I don't think the city's going to let anybody in unless they drove up in a Wonder Bread truck full of bread. I don't think they're going to let anybody in because that's just more to take care of. So here's the thing, though. These lepers realized they couldn't go back in the past either. They said back in the city. Apparently that's where they started out, in the city. A lot of people say, oh, I wish we could go back to the good old days. Well, that's called nostalgia. And let's just face it, the good old days were not as good as we remember them. When you were in the good old days, you were wanting to get out of the good old days. Nostalgia is a recollection of the past that never existed. It's sort of like when you go to high school reunions, and y'all talk about how great everything was. The whole time you're in high school, you're thinking, oh, man, I wish I could get out of this place. So they had one other option. They said, let's go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we'll live. But if they kill us, we will die. So there was really only one option that they had that was actually a possibility of making it. And that was to go to the enemy's camp. So that's what they decided to do. They got up and they left at twilight. They probably left at twilight so that the archers on the wall wouldn't use them as target practice when they walked away from the gates, and so that the Syrians wouldn't recognize that they're lepers on the way there. So they went at twilight, and it says that God made the enemy hear the sound of chariots and horses. Now, were there chariots and horses there? No. None of that was there. It was 4 lepers. They might not have had 8 good feet between them. They might have had 7.5 or 6.5 feet. And God caused, from them walking, the enemy to hear horses and chariots, and scared the bejeebies out of them to where they just got up and ran away and left all their stuff. Left their camels, left their chariots, left their gold, left their clothes, left their tents, and they just fled for their lives, screaming like 5th grade girls, running away. Did the lepers have any idea of what was happening? No, they didn't have any idea at all. Did God know what was happening? Absolutely. In fact, God had told Elisha that this was going to happen, and the people in the city didn't believe him. So they walked in and they got all this stuff there, and they went back. They said, it's not right for us to celebrate and have this and other people starving. So their conscience got a hold of them, and they went back and they told the people what God had done. One of the things that is so amazing about this story is how God uses the most unlikely to accomplish the greatest things. See, in other words, there's no way anybody would ever think 4 lepers defeated the Syrian army and made them run away. It had to be God. And you would think Jehoram would have been happy and said, praise God. Didn't change his heart a bit. Didn't change his heart a bit. So one of the lessons to draw from this is that no matter how bad things are or things appear, you always have a choice. And if you step out in faith and take a chance. Now, staying where you are, that's not stepping out in faith. That's not taking a chance. That's just trying to keep what you got. Going back is kind of denial in a way. It's denying the reality of where we need to go. But moving ahead means, okay, I acknowledge that where I'm at, I don't need to be. I need to move forward. I don't know what's up ahead. I don't know what the future holds. But you know what? If I don't do this, what else is there? And that's what they did, and that's where God works. He works in that element of faith. And they stepped out in faith, and that's where He worked. What doesn't count is our abilities and our competency. What counts is our surrender. Notice what they said here. They said, let's get up, go and surrender. So here's what they did. They went and they surrendered. I think for us, if God's going to use us in a way, probably in a way as significant as these men could be used, we have to go and we have to surrender as well. So anyway, that's my lesson for the day. So let's pray.
Thank you for listening to the 4Heroes podcast. Like Jimmy said, no matter how bad things appear, you always have a choice to step out of what's familiar, out of what you know, and move forward in faith. If you're not sure what moving forward in faith looks like, if the adversities you're facing feel impossible to face on your own, we're here to support you. Please contact us via text at 770-301-5580, through social media, or email us at info@4ourheroes.org.